We're going to look at the effects of the Industrial Revolution today. Now, we're mainly going to focus on the impact it had on industrialized countries like England, America, your major European powers. So to begin with, the first impact that what happened with the Industrial Revolution for industrialized countries compared to non-industrialized countries would be a population increase. So as you can see here on our graph, this is the estimated population of England from 1750 to 1851. So this is around the time that the Industrial Revolution, we typically say it begins. And then certainly the Industrial Revolution doesn't stop in 1851, but this just shows you like over 100 years approximately the population. Okay, so we're looking at population in millions. Now they also divide this down into your rural population and your urban population. But just in general, if you look at our graph, right, we go from 5.7, almost 5.8 million people in 1750 at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to, by 1851, we're at over 16 million people. Okay, over 16.7 million people. So the population has grown substantially, right? And of course that's in large part due to things like the agricultural revolution that England experiences with crop rotation and things like that, right? And so one of the things that happens is we have more population because people are going to have access to more food. They also have better food sources, right? Now that we're able to grow, which means people also live longer, and we're able to have people who are able to produce more children. Okay, and so the population increases substantially between, as the graph shows, 1750 to 1851. Now the next thing is that for industrialized countries, the standards of living increased for some, but not all. Okay, now up until the Industrial Revolution, people lived, in little cottages, all right, in rural areas, your little village. Okay, but with the increased industrialization that industrialized countries are going to experience, not only in England, but this applies to America as well, what happens is cities grow because factories grow. Because factories grow and more population is moving in, we have to have some place to house them. So what happens is factories often build these, what we call like row houses here in the United States, right? And today we might call them something like townhomes. Okay, but what happens is you have these little houses which are still common in England today, especially in your industrialized cities like London, Manchester, Liverpool, okay, but also fairly common throughout all of England. But you have these houses. Now they were very small, right, in the industrial times, but this shows a home in London in 1890. And so this is the home of a worker. This is not the home of a middle-class person. These are your working class people. Okay. Now on the right you have the luxuries, as the picture is called, for industrial owners. So for your factory owners, your managers of your factories, your middle class people, they have much larger homes. Okay, so this entire thing could be their house. Okay, and so there's all kinds of different rooms that they have. Bedrooms and a living room and like a piano, right? And they have the downstairs, and then even here, this would be your first floor. There's even a basement. Right? Because if you're a wealthy industrial middle class family, you might have live-in help, right? And so your help would live downstairs, or they would work downstairs, but up here in the attic is where they lived, okay? And so all of this is one house for your middle class family, your factory owners, your managers, the middle class. But over here you have the working class. Okay, you have like a bedroom, and you might have downstairs where it's like a kitchen, dining room type of situation combined. Okay, and of course you have your back patio over here, but quite different circumstances. Okay, and typically the working class lived close to your factories, whereas the upper classes, your middle class people, lived away from the town center, away from your factories, okay, in industrialized countries. And that's how we end up with suburbs, basically. Now, this is an example, a real picture that I took on my trip to Scotland. This is in Glasgow, Scotland, a major industrial center in Scotland. And if you look closely enough, this is basically what houses looked like. Now, today a lot of these are converted into like shops downstairs and apartments upstairs. So like, and you have whatever business this is, and then you have an apartment upstairs. And if you look closely as well, you can see it's this is supposed to be like white stone, but it's not very white. It's kind of dingy looking, right? It's very dirty. And that's because these are built close to factories back in the day, and so a lot of that coal soot, the soot from coal burning factories, would basically become permanent onto your surfaces. Now, we also have, for industrialized countries, improved transportation. So we go from steam locomotives, okay, and this happens to be a picture I took at the Roanoke Museum of Transportation. And so if you go there, they have all kinds of trains, and you can look at the progress that we've made with trains from the early days, like the 1800s, on through even today in the 21st century. But this train comes, this would be like a coal burning, this is where your coal would be stored, okay, and this is a coal burning, steam powered train. Your coal is here, you shovel it into the engine here, right, and this is basically like your boiler. And so this was the cutting edge technology by the 1800s. Now eventually, as we progress through the Industrial Revolution and we start to get things like electricity, we end up in cities with electrical trolley cars, for instance. Okay? And so, no matter whether we're in places like the United States, major cities like Chicago, Boston, New York, or even in London, Manchester, wherever in England, or even, say, Paris, or wherever in the continent of Europe, right, we start to see that new transportation, right? So no longer do you have to walk anywhere or everywhere. No longer is it relying on horse and buggy, but now we have steam engines. Eventually we now have trolley cars to take us within town, and this gets us from place to place, right? And so this begins for European countries and even America, right? This is how we got around. And obviously transportation has improved quite a lot since then, but this was cutting edge technology in the 18 and 1900s. Now, you do have urbanization, and environmental pollution would also be a problem. So urbanization, because again, your small farmers who have left their land, their village, they had to move into the city somewhere where the jobs are in factories. And so again, we build houses near our factories for our workers, and urbanization happens, right? The growth of cities. You also have environmental pollution. And so again, you can look and see, this is another picture I took in Glasgow in Scotland, but you can look at how dirty it is, right? Because of all the soot that still, kind of remains on these buildings from the pollution. And so, if you would go back in time to the 1800s when these factories were in full swing, the sky was just clouded, okay, with soot and smoke, and it was dirty, and it wasn't very clean. Okay? But we had, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, in the early parts of the 1800s and latter part of the 1700s, environmental pollution also included all kinds of pollution, okay, not just from the factories, but from homes as well. Right, because the primary means of heating your house would have been a fireplace that often you burnt coal. And so we have soot being produced, and there was no regulations on this stuff. There was no sewer systems that were in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So you have a lot of environmental pollution. Now, another impact is increased education. So now, eventually, we're going to look at what happens because children do work in the factories, but we begin to look at, as part of this Enlightenment that's left over from the Enlightenment of the 1700s, we start to see the desire for education, right? And we know that Napoleon in France had set up public education. Well, England would also establish public education. America would establish public education in various states. But there's an increased education. Now, it's mainly for your middle class and your upper classes, not your working class people, right? It's not for your average, ordinary factory worker. It's for the middle class people in the beginning. Now, eventually we'll look at how that changes, but that's in the beginning. You also have the dissatisfaction of the working class with working conditions. So when we look at the factory system, we'll look at how the working conditions were, and they were terrible conditions, far worse than what factories might be today. Factories are relatively safe today compared to what they were in the 17 and 1800s. But the working class are going to get fed up with their situation and with their living conditions, and there's calls for reforms and changes. And so we'll look at how they attempt to solve these problems later. Now again, you do have the growth of the middle class. With more people with that available capital, you have people who are going to start factories and businesses and shopkeepers. Now that you have cities, you have more businesses that are going to open up, more shops for people to shop in and whatnot. So you had the growth of the middle class, as the picture here depicts a nice, happy Victorian family in the 1800s of England. Okay, and so this would be their luxurious home.